I'll say this much about the night shift hits got a rhythm. Sure, it's a weird rhythm, a mix of quiet hums and the occasional storm of chaos. But once you get into it, there's a kind of peace in knowing that most of the world is asleep, while you're the one keeping it together. That is, until nights like this one. It started just past 2 a.m. when I was doing my usual rounds and seriously debating whether the vending machine's questionable granola bar would qualify as breakfast. The intercom crackled to life, and I heard those two words that every nurse dreads: code black. Now, for those blissfully unfamiliar, a code black means one thing: someone's flipping tables, screaming bloody murder, or worse. Tonight, that someone was in room 22. Great, I thought. Room 22. Of course, because room 22 couldn't just house someone quietly recovering from appendicitis. No, it had to be the scene of tonight's horror show. Grabbing my clipboard, I made my way toward the room. The hallway stretched out in front of me, eerily quiet except for the soft hum of the fluorescents overhead. As I got closer, I swear I felt the temperature drop. Probably just my imagination, I told myself, but my body wasn't buying it. Then I heard it. Eva. It was a whisper, faint but unmistakable. I froze mid-step, glancing behind me. Empty hallways, no one around. Ava, it came again, from ahead this time. I swallowed hard. Okay, that's new, I muttered under my breath, trying to shake it off. Nurses don't spook easily comes with the territory. I figured it was just some weirdo patient trying to psyche me out. Or maybe I'd finally gone full sleep deprived. Either way, I wasn't about to let it mess with me. When I opened the door to room 22, the first thing I noticed was how still everything was. The guy Mr. Delaney was strapped down to the bed, wrists and ankles bound tight to the rails. He wasn't thrashing or yelling, like I'd expected. No, he was lying there perfectly calm, his head tilted just enough to look me dead in the eye, and he was smiling. It wasn't the kind of smile you see on a person happy to be alive. It was wrong, like he knew something I didn't and was enjoying every second of it. Eva, he said, his voice low but clear as day. My stomach dropped. I hadn't introduced myself. Who told you my name? I asked, trying to sound more confident than I felt. He didn't answer, just kept grinning like we were old friends. You've been having doubts lately, haven't you? He said suddenly, his voice soft but cutting through the silence like a scalpel. About your job, about your life, about whether anyone would really notice if you just disappeared. My heart skipped a beat. Nobody knew about those thoughts, not my coworkers, not my friends, and certainly not this man I'd never met before tonight. You keep it all bottled up, he went on, his voice almost teasing now, pretending you're fine. But you're not, are you? I took a step back, my hand gripping the clipboard like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. How do you know that? He tilted his head, still smiling. Because I hear you, Eva. I hear everything. I couldn't move, couldn't look away from those piercing eyes. You think you can keep secrets from me? He whispered, his smile widening just enough to send a cold wave through my chest. And that's when I realized I wasn't alone in that room. Not really. Let me back up for a second, because honestly, you probably need some context. My name's Eva, and I've been a nurse for over a decade. I've seen more bodily fluids than a crime scene investigator, stitched up things that looked like they belonged in a butcher shop, and kept a straight face through some truly bizarre patient stories. You'd think nothing would shake me at this point. You'd be wrong. I wasn't always on the night shift. I used to work days, back when my life felt, I don't know, normal, before the divorce. Anyway, day shifts were predictable, filled with sunlight and visitors bringing balloons. But after everything went sideways with my ex, the last thing I wanted was daylight. Too bright, too cheerful. Night shifts felt safer, quieter. Of course, quieter is a double-edged sword. You know how silence makes your brain start noticing every little thing? Like how the fluorescent lights in the halls hum just a little too loudly, or how your reflection in a dark window looks like it might blink when you're not looking. Add to that the fact that hospitals at night are basically one giant audition for a horror movie, and you've got yourself a recipe for paranoia. Take the older wings of the hospital, for example. Those halls are practically falling apart, sealed off except for emergencies, but they still manage to be unsettling. Not in a ghost hunter's kind of way at least that's what I told myself, but there's something off about them. Staff would joke about shadows that move on their own, and even though I don't buy into that kind of thing, I couldn't help feeling watched whenever I walked by those doors. Which brings me to room 22. Now, room 22 wasn't technically in one of the old wings, but it was close enough to feel connected, like whatever weirdness haunted those halls might have crept in. Mr. Delaney, the patient, had been brought in earlier that night. According to the paramedics, they found him wandering a graveyard at midnight, barefoot and muttering something about the Whispering Ones. Great. Just what I needed in amateur seance enthusiast with a flair for dramatics. When I asked the paramedics for more details, they exchanged a look. One of them, a big guy with tired eyes, leaned in and said, "He wasn't just talking to himself, he was answering." "Answering what?" I asked, trying not to roll my eyes. "That's the thing," the guy said, lowering his voice. "There was no one there." Perfect. Because what's a night shift without a patient straight out of a Stephen King novel? Before I could even fully process that nugget of joy, I ran into Hank, the janitor. Hank's been at the hospital longer than anyone, and has a knack for saying the exact thing you don't want to hear. "Room 22, huh?" he said, pushing his mop bucket past me. "You know that room hasn't been normal for years, right?" I stopped in my tracks. "Define normal, Hank." He shrugged, not even slowing down. "Let's just say things happen in there. Lights flicker, doors lock themselves, and that was before the last guy died in there." "Helpful. Thanks." I called after him, but he was already gone. Standing outside room 22 now, the paramedics' words and Hank's ominous mutterings felt a little too loud in my head. And let's not forget the whole whispering my name incident. It wasn't like I could just quit and go home, though. Night shifts may be quiet, but they're still my responsibility, and I wasn't about to let a creepy patient get under my skin. At least, that's what I told myself. What I couldn't shake was the way Mr. Delaney had looked at me when I walked into that room. Like he knew me better than I knew myself. Like he was waiting for something. And then there were his words. "You think you can keep secrets from me?" I didn't know what he meant, but the more I thought about it, the less I liked the idea of finding out. The thing about hospitals at night is that they're supposed to feel quiet. A calm that comes from knowing most of your patients are asleep. The halls are empty, and nothing too dramatic happens until morning rounds. Except tonight wasn't quiet. It started small, so small in fact, that I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. I'd be walking past the nurse's station, and out of nowhere, I'd hear it. "Eva!" Always faint. Always just behind me. The first time, I whipped around so fast I nearly dropped my clipboard. No one was there. Just the empty halls stretching out behind me, fluorescents flickering like they were auditioning for a bad horror movie. The second time, I told myself it was the air vents. Hospitals have old ventilation systems. They groan, they wheeze. They probably whisper your name in the dead of night, right? By the third time, I was starting to lose my cool. "Very funny," I muttered under my breath, hoping it was some bored coworker messing with me. The laugh I forced out didn't make me feel any better. Things escalated when I made my next round near room 22. The heart monitor inside the room flatlined a long, sharp beep that sent my pulse skyrocketing. I rushed in, prepared for the worst, only to find Mr. Delaney lying there, grinning like we were old friends. His monitor, which should have been flatlined, suddenly spiked erratically the moment I stepped into the room. "Having fun?" he asked, his voice calm and casual, like we were chatting over coffee. I glanced at the monitor, then back at him. "You know," he chuckled. "Oh, Eva, you still don't get it, do you?" I folded my arms, determined not to let him get under my skin. "Get what?" "They like you," he said, his eyes locking onto mine with unnerving intensity. "They've chosen you." "Who's they?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, though my brain was doing somersaults trying to make sense of his words. "You'll see," he said, leaning his head back against the pillow. His smirk didn't fade. By now, the whispers weren't just a faint annoyance, they were constant. I'd hear them in the empty halls, at the nurse's station, even in the break room when I tried to pour myself a cup of coffee to calm my nerves. It wasn't just me either. Other staff started complaining, though they didn't say much, just muttered things like, "Feels like someone's watching me," or "That room gives me the creeps." One of the newer nurses, a guy named Todd, confided in me during a rare moment of calm. "I swear, I saw something move in the corner of my eye when I was near room 22, like a shadow." I wanted to tell him it was nothing, just his imagination, but the words felt hollow even as I thought them. As the night dragged on, I started piecing things together. Room 22 wasn't just another room, it had a history. Decades ago, it had been sealed off after a series of unexplained deaths. The patients had no connections to one another, no medical reasons to die, but one by one, they did. I found an old file stashed in a cabinet near the break room, dusty and forgotten. Inside were faded photos of the room, from years ago, blood splatter on the walls, mangled equipment, and a name scrawled in jagged handwriting on the wall. "Eva." I slammed the file shut and stared at the coffee machine, willing myself to breathe. This was ridiculous. It had to be some sick prank, a coincidence, anything but the alternative. The whispers didn't care. Every step I took, they followed. Every time I looked into the reflective surface of a window or monitor, I half expected to see someone hear something behind me. And then there was Mr. Delaney, still restrained in room 22, still grinning like he knew how this would all end. "They're closer now," he said the next time I checked on him. "What's closer?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to hear the answer. "You'll see soon enough," he replied, his voice calm but heavy with something I couldn't quite name. He shifted his gaze to the corner of the room, his grin widening. I couldn't help but follow his eyes, though there was nothing there. Nothing I could see anyway. You know that point in the night when everything feels a little too surreal? When you're not sure if you're exhausted or if the world is genuinely unraveling around you? Yeah, I was there. The whispers hadn't stopped. If anything, they'd gotten louder, more deliberate. There were phrases, now half-formed sentences, that dissolved into static in my head. I tried to drown them out with coffee and work, but no amount of caffeine or paperwork could block out the sound of my own name dripping from the air like it had a mind of its own. That's when I decided I needed answers. The hospital archives weren't exactly user-friendly. Think decades of poorly organized files, most of them crammed into a dusty storage room no one had touched since bell-bottoms were in fashion. But if there was something about room 22's history, it had to be in there. After about an hour of sifting through yellowed papers, my hand landed on a leather-bound logbook. The date stamped on the cover read 1963. It smelled like mildew and regret, and the first few pages were boring enough to make me question my life choices. Patient intakes, dosages, nothing out of the ordinary. But then I hit a section marked Project Whisper. The notes started off clinical, detailing behavioral anomalies in violent patients. Apparently, they'd been running some kind of experiment in room 22. The goal? To communicate with the beyond. Because why just treat sick people when you can poke at the supernatural while you're at it? The entries grew darker as I read on. Patients were reporting whispers like mine calling their names, urging them to do things, violent things. The log described one patient who broke his own restraints, another who screamed for hours about something in the walls. The final entry stopped me cold. Patient 1027 exhibited heightened aggression following auditory phenomena. Subject became non-responsive after claiming, "The whisperer has awakened." I slammed the book shut and stared at the flickering light overhead. This wasn't just some ghost story. People had died in that room, people who heard exactly what I was hearing now. And speaking of dying, that's when the call button for room 22 lit up. When I got there, Delaney was lying perfectly still, his smirk gone for the first time since he'd arrived. His breathing was shallow, his skin pale under the harsh hospital lights. I approached cautiously, half expecting him to lunge at me with some cryptic comment about how I didn't know what was coming. Instead, he opened his eyes just enough to meet mine. "See you soon, Eva," he whispered. And then, nothing. His heart monitor let out that long, flatline beep that every nurse dreads. Except this time, it wasn't just the monitor. The whispers swelled all around me, no longer faint or distant. They were here, in the room, like a crowd pressing in, unseen but undeniably there. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the chair in the corner. The monitor spiked again, erratic, though Delaney was gone. "You've got to be kidding me," I muttered. Because humor is apparently my defense mechanism when things are completely falling apart. The whispers didn't care. They grew louder, sharper, and for the first time, I understood a word among the chaos. "Stay. Let me tell you, there's nothing quite like coming home after a shift like that. You drag yourself through the door, kick off your shoes, and hope the weight of the day stays outside. Except this time, it followed me in. It started as soon as I shut the door behind me. "Eva," a voice murmured, faint but unmistakable. I froze mid-step, the sound hitting me like ice water down my back. My apartment was empty, or at least, it should have been. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself, locking the door with a little more force than necessary. "It's just your brain playing tricks on you." Except it didn't stop. The whispers seemed to seep from the walls, soft and persistent. They weren't just calling my name anymore, they were laughing, mocking thoughts I hadn't dared to speak out loud. "You always knew he'd leave," one of them hissed, a voice so close to my ear I spun around, heart pounding. The lights above flickered once, then twice. My reflection in the hallway mirror caught my eye, and for a moment, I could have sworn it smiled at me. Not the strained, exhausted kind of smile I might have been wearing. No, this one was wide, almost gleeful. I stepped closer, leaning in, and the smirk disappeared as quickly as it had come. My own face stared back at me, pale and drawn, like I hadn't slept in weeks. "Great," I mumbled. "Now even my reflection is screwing with me." I decided to distract myself with the mundane cooking, cleaning, anything to drown out the feeling that my apartment wasn't entirely mine anymore. It worked for about an hour, until the lights flickered again, and the whispers started up like clockwork. "You can't run," they teased. That's when I noticed the glass I'd left on the kitchen counter had moved just a few inches, but enough to make me stop breathing for a second. "All right," I said aloud, forcing a laugh that felt too loud in the suffocating silence. "Good one, ghosts. You got me." The glass didn't respond, but the lights went out completely for 3 long seconds before snapping back on. By the time I crawled into bed, I was done. Done with the whispers, done with the lights, done with everything. I pulled the blankets over my head like I was 5 years old again, and whispered a half-hearted, "Leave me alone," into the dark. The whispers didn't leave. If anything, they got louder. The next day, I confided in Todd, the same colleague who'd mentioned seeing something near room 22. "Night shifts mess with your head," he said, Shrugging like he hadn't heard a word I said. Maybe take a break. Go to a yoga class or something. Yoga wasn't going to fix this. As the days went on, I started seeing things. Shadowy figures darting just outside my field of vision, shapes that melted into nothing the moment I turned to look. One night, I woke to find my apartment door wide open. I live alone. For a long moment, I just stared at it, too afraid to move. The whispers were louder than ever now, practically vibrating through the walls. "Come back to us," they cooed, overlapping voices blending into a cacophony that made my head pound. My first instinct was to grab something, a knife, a lamp, anything I could use as a weapon, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. You can't exactly stab something you can't see. I crept toward the door, my breath coming in short bursts, and slammed it shut with every ounce of strength I had left. My hands were shaking as I locked it, but the whispers didn't let up. "You can't hide," they said. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about room 22 anymore. Whatever this was, it wasn't confined to the hospital. It was everywhere. I'm not sure what was worse, the whispers that haunted me every moment, or the realization that running wasn't going to stop them. Whatever this thing was, it had wormed its way into my life, my thoughts, my head. I couldn't take it anymore. So I did what any normal sleep-deprived person would do. I decided to go straight to the source. Because why not? Maybe throwing myself back into the fire would somehow douse the flames. Or maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't losing it. Room 22 was as quiet as ever when I arrived at the hospital. Too quiet. I hesitated at the door, my hand hovering just above the handle. "Okay, Eva," I whispered to myself. "You've handled worse. Remember Mr. Accidentally Swallowed a Fork? This is just another weird Tuesday night." The second I opened the door, I knew I was in trouble. The air inside felt thick, like stepping into a sauna but without the heat. The walls seemed off. At first, I thought it was the flickering fluorescent lights messing with my eyes, but then I realized the walls were moving, pulsing, like they were alive. The whispers swirled around me, louder than ever, overlapping in a chaotic mess of voices. Some were angry, some were pleading, and all of them knew exactly what buttons to push. "She knows it's her fault," one of them hissed. "She doesn't belong here," another sneered. The room seemed to stretch, the corners melting into shadows that bled together. My legs felt heavy, like I was wading through wet cement, but I forced myself forward. "All right, Whisperer," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "You've got my attention. What do you want?" The whispers didn't answer, at least not in words. Instead, shapes began to form in the shadows. Figures, pale and barely there, stepped out of the walls like they'd been hiding there all along. Their faces were blank, but their mouths moved in unison, spilling my darkest thoughts into the room. "You should have done more for her," one voice said, sharp and accusatory. "He deserved better," another added, soft but cutting. They weren't random. These were my own thoughts, the ones I'd buried so deep I'd almost convinced myself they weren't there. Regrets, guilt, things I didn't dare acknowledge. In the light of day, they were all laid bare here, in this pulsing, shifting room. And then he appeared. Mr. Delaney, or at least something wearing his face, stepped out from the shadows. He looked exactly as he had the night he died, except now his smirk was back, sharper and more menacing than ever. "You came back," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "I knew you would. They always do." "Who are you?" I demanded, though my voice sounded much smaller than I'd intended. "You already know," he said, taking a slow step toward me. "You can hear us. You've always been able to hear us, haven't you? That's why you were chosen." "Chosen for what?" My hands were shaking, but I clenched them into fists, refusing to let him see how scared I was. "To join us," he said simply, his smile widening. You belong to us now. The room closed in around me, the walls practically breathing, the whispers deafening. I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. And deep down, I knew running wouldn't matter. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't going to let me go. The voices drilled into my head, dredging up every doubt, every mistake, every moment of fear I'd ever had. It wasn't just trying to scare me, it was feeding on me, growing stronger with every second I stayed in that room. Not today, I muttered under my breath, digging my nails into my palms. You're not taking me today. I took a step forward, then another, until I was standing right in front of Delaney, the thing pretending to be him. Leave me alone, I said, my voice steady for the first time all night. Whatever you are, whatever you want, you're not getting it from me. The whispers faltered. Just for a second. Delaney's smirk faded, replaced by something that looked almost like surprise. And then, just like that, everything went still. The walls stopped moving. The shadows melted away. The room was empty again, the air light and quiet, as if nothing had ever happened. I didn't wait to find out if it was a trick. I turned and walked out of that room, not looking back. I'll be honest, I didn't walk out of room 22 so much as stumble out of it, my legs threatening to give up under me. My head was spinning, and the whispers, while quieter, were still there. They burrowed in deep, like a bad song stuck on repeat. Only this one came with a side of existential dread. I made it to the break room somehow, collapsing onto one of those awful plastic chairs that have seen too much and still refuse to break. I stared at my shaking hands, willing the tremors to stop. That's it, I whispered to myself. I'm done. I don't care if I have to scrub floors at a gas station. I'm not stepping foot in this hospital again. And I didn't. The next day, I quit. No 2-week notice, no heartfelt goodbye. I just handed in my badge, mumbled something about needing a life reset, and walked out the front door for the last time. I moved to a dingy apartment on the other side of town, one of those places where the rent's cheap because the walls are thin, and the neighbors argue loudly about who left the milk out. It was perfect. Just enough noise to drown out the whispers that still lingered in the back of my mind. For a while, I thought it was working. The voices were faint, almost like a distant hum, and I convinced myself they were fading. I even started thinking about getting a cat. Then, 3 months later, a package arrived. It was waiting for me on my doorstep, wrapped in plain brown paper with no return address. My first thought was that it was something I'd ordered during a late-night online shopping spree. But when I picked it up, it felt wrong. Too heavy, too solid. I brought it inside, sat it on the table, and stared at it for a good 10 minutes before finally opening it. Inside was the logbook, the same battered, faded journal I'd found in the hospital. The one that should have been locked up or burned or buried somewhere far away from me. There was a note tucked into the front cover, scrawled in handwriting that looked oddly familiar. You can't run from us. My first instinct was to throw the whole thing into the trash, maybe set it on fire for good measure. But before I could move, the whispers came back, louder this time. Closer. Eva, they cooed, drawing out my name like they were savoring it. I dropped the note, backing away from the table as the air in the room seemed to shift. The walls felt like they were closing in, the faint hum in my head now a roaring chorus. You thought it was over? One voice teased. Welcome back, another murmured, almost fondly. I pressed my hands to my ears, but it didn't help. The voices weren't coming from outside, they were inside me now, crawling through my thoughts like they belonged there. The logbook sat on the table, open to a page I didn't remember flipping to. The words seemed to shimmer, rearranging themselves into a single sentence. You were ours from the start. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, listening to the voices swell until they filled every corner of my mind. All I know is, when they finally stopped, It wasn't because they were gone. It was because I'd stopped fighting them.